Hello, and welcome to the official Apex Magazine 2021 book launch. I am Lesley Conner. I am co-editor of Apex Magazine 2021 and Apex Magazine. And I am joined today by three authors who are in Apex Magazine 2021. Hello, and welcome. Would you guys like to introduce yourself?
Okay, glad to be here and glad to see all of you finally, not just words on the page, but just actual people. So my name is Elana Gomel, and I'm a professor of English literature, and I'm also a writer. And my story is called The Nida, and it was published in the plague year, and it's connected to the story itself. So I can talk more about it, but I would like to to hear your introductions.
You want me to go next?
Sure.
Okay. I was like, who are we going to do the stare down thing? I'm Beth Dawkins. My story was also in 2021. And Elam is Forever was, I was probably not even a month after having my kid when I wrote it. And it was a very 3 a.m. in the morning kind of story that's when I worked mainly at the time for that. Yeah, I'm excited to talk about it.
Awesome. And I'm Maggie Slater. My story is also in Apex Magazine 2021. It was called Candyland, about kind of social media and kind of a weird twist on the Midas touch. And yeah, I wrote that one. Actually, surprisingly, we have that in common. I wrote that one about a month after my second was born. So that was, I was in a weird headspace, and that worked out well for me. So that worked out good.
It's funny that you're both like, it was like in this weird postpartum parenting headspace, which is interesting because how do you think being a mom and parenthood and having infants influences not only how you write, but what you write?
Yeah, for me, it definitely added some urgency to those times. I think the one thing I tell people when it comes to having kids is you will learn to be very efficient. Like those nice long routines of getting tea and all that. Like I don't do any of that. I just sit down and I work, and it may only be for 20 minutes, but that's all I've got. So I don't know if you've also found that to be the case, Beth.
Oh yeah. Like when I did that, I think it was in this weird space where I'd had a couple of stories published in 2020, and I was kind of like I wanted to keep that rolling. And he was my first child, and I was determined that I was not going to slow down. But I think that's a part of the postpartum headspace where you're like, this won't get me. I'm going to work every single moment I have, which is crazy sauce. And you learn better later.
I have found
there's a certain level of desperation of like not wanting to lose.
Well, there is. And I found with myself that as my kids got older, because my kids are 20 and 15, it was like at first, I was like, nope, gonna keep going. But then it was like as I got older, I started giving that time away to things that for them, like Girl Scouts or like recitals or homework or just sitting and watching a movie. And now I'm like, they'll be out soon and I can get back to it. Elana, I wanted to talk specifically about the opening of your story because it is just so spot on and so perfect. I was rereading all of the stories this morning and I was just like, I love the opening of your story. So it says, I am not the woman I once was. None of us are. Epidemics are the fire and we are the candle wax. When the fire burns out, we are melted and reshaped. So when COVID hit and we realized that it was going to be longer than the 3 weeks or whatever, like it just kept going on. I know there was a lot of conversation between Jason and I about not getting bogged down in all kinds of like epidemic stories because we got a lot. But it was like when yours came through the slush pile, we were like, this is the one. Now, we've ended up, I mean, we're 3 years in at this point. So we've ended up publishing more than just one, but for a long time, yours was just like, this is it. This is all we're going to say about epidemics. We're going to let that stand. But I think that beginning is just so beautiful. Do you want to kind of discuss like how your story started?
Right. So first of all, let me just say before I talk about pandemics is that I totally identify with, I have 2 kids and they're grown up by now, but I still remember those times, you know, when you have half an hour before your kid comes back from whatever preschool and you have to write something, because I was also doing my PhD when my kids were, you know, in diapers, so it wasn't easy. But actually, it is connected to the beginning of the story because the story is also about motherhood. It's not just about the plague. It's not just the COVID story. It's not actually about a COVID at all. It's about the bond between mothers and daughters. And I don't have daughters. I have 2 sons. But my mother passed away like very prematurely, like 10 years ago. And it totally changed me in ways which I'm only now beginning to understand. Motherhood changes you in the same way. You know, you feel like, okay, I've given birth. Okay, I have my time is different. My schedule is different, but I'm still the same person, but you are not. You're something else. And this shift is so subtle and so profound. It will take you the rest of your life to discover how being a mother has changed you, how being a daughter, you know, has changed you, and how having lived through COVID has changed all of us, because it has. And again, the changes are not necessarily like obvious, okay? I am like flying again, I'm teaching, I'm doing all those things which I used to do, but deep inside, there is something else, something different. And we can talk about what it is. You can talk about how precarious life has become, how much more we're aware of the fact that we're biological creatures, you know, we live and die just like bacteria and viruses. And this is the connection for me between the pandemic and motherhood. We are, you know, when you give birth, you give life. But in certain sense, you also become aware of your own mortality. You give life, but it takes something out of you, and there's something you will never get it back. So that's my take on it. And this is how I wrote the story, as a connection between all those biological forces which change us and make us what we are and give us something. Because I learned something about myself during the COVID, which, you know, may not necessarily something I wanted to know, but I did learn. And the same thing with motherhood, you know, you learn things, and those are very hard lessons, but they are necessary. So first of all, congratulations on your stories and your kids. And to me, the 2 are connected, you know, despite all the constraints of time and everything else. It is a creative process, giving birth and bringing up a child and writing.
Yeah, I agree. It is a definitely a creative process. And like I said, my kids are older, so it's like I'm at that cusp of like, they don't need me 100% all the time anymore, which is weird because for so long, when your kids are little, like you kind of revolve everything you do around what they need from you. Like your time is kind of stolen in pockets because they aren't needing you right there. And you think when they're that age that you're like, oh, I'm really like, I can't wait until they don't need me all the time. But then when it happens, you're like, wait a second, it went so fast. Like,
Yeah.
please need
The
me.
days are long, but the years fly by.
Oh my gosh, it's so true. It's so true. Maggie, your story deals kind of with social media and this idealized portrait we all sort of present and the pressure of that. And well, let's face it, social media is kind of a weird place right at this moment.
At this moment, yeah, it's changed a lot, even just in the last year.
Right. So, I mean, how do you think that today's social media kind of like weirdness would impact the characters in your story?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely was taken from a little bit older experience of that. I had just gotten on Instagram at that point. I was writing really from a place of kind of once one gets past that like 10-year high school reunion kind of thing, running into those people that you used to know. I come from a fairly affluent town, so a lot of those people have done a lot of things. I mean, my next door neighbor was a rock star. He actually toured Europe and was doing a bunch of things, and that was like kind of normal. But then you also get all the social media around that, so you can't
Maggie, you're frozen.
kind of get away from it to some
Yeah.
know him as but okay. But knowing someone outside of social media versus knowing them in social media is a very different experience. One of my friends in particular had a lot of stuff that was going on in her life, but it wasn't something she really felt she could talk about on social media because nobody really, she didn't feel anyone would really be interested, and she was just complaining. And so none of that got on. So it was all smiles and book photos and all of these kind of things. And it's a bizarre duel, very interesting, and how much we refer to those things as eye candy and things like that. So that's kind of where that story evolved out of.
Okay, yeah, I read that story, and it was one of those stories that I immediately was like sending to Jason, and I'm like, you need to read this right now because we need this story. like I understood it in my soul.
There was something very personal about it for me too, where I was just like, oh God, this hurts so much. And just the way we are forced to spin things in a positive light rather than just accepting that it's not good.
Yeah.
Especially during the pandemic where things were very, very difficult.
Yeah, all my if you go back on Instagram during the pandemic, all my pictures are just like book covers because that's all I was doing was staying home and reading. Like I wasn't going anywhere.
And I loved those posts, by the way. Those were always very interesting to me.
I one of my Girl Scouts mom follows my Instagram. She's like, I was looking. She goes, you read a lot. I'm like, yes, I do. So Beth, your story deals with an AI, and well, a ship, and I always struggle with not giving away too much of the story when we're doing these things because I want people to read them, but also I want to discuss them. But it's told from the perspective of an AI, and it's really interesting the way that how the reader sees that shifts as we're reading.
Yeah, I think the best way to describe it is, yeah, so you're seeing it from the ship's point of view, who's not actually a good character, like at all, like at all. And I feel like that story is more about the people on the ship than the actual main character that's telling the story. And it was a really, 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 really fun one to write because it's in the point of view of a character that's kind of a villain. And sometimes it's really fun to write. And that's, I was looking, I think at that point, I really wanted to write really fun things. And that's weird to say that story was really fun to write, but it really was.
No, I get that.
Yeah. And like, it's funny because when y'all said that it was going to be narrated, I kept thinking, how? And then I heard the narration. I'm like, oh my God, this is so much better than when I wrote it. Like, this is like way better. I felt like that medium fit it so well.
Right, definitely.
I was blown away, for sure.
That's an interesting thing to think about, because it's like, okay, so we do a podcast every month for Apex Magazine. So and we publish every 2 months. So that means that 2 stories out of the issue we're going to be podcasting. And it's always kind of an interesting discussion between Jason and I to try to decide, like, which stories do we feel like are best served by being a podcast, because some stories just, it's like they come to life when you do a podcast in a way that just reading them on the page they might not, but other stories, they just don't click as well. So yeah, it's always like an interesting discussion of like which stories are we going to podcast and why, like how is this going to change the way that this story is read by the reader, like how they're going to interpret it and everything. And your story is definitely one where having a podcast gave it like this like next level
Yeah,
of awesomeness, like a shine of awesomeness on top of all the other awesomeness. So yeah, it's a fun part of the job, is trying to come up like which of the stories are best going to be served by having a podcast. And then I just like hand it over to the podcast producer, and I'm like, make it magic. Like there are certain other jobs within Apex where I'm like, I don't understand how you do it, but you're wonderful. So talking about writing routines, Elana, what does your writing routine look like? Because I mean, you said you're a professor, so I'm sure that takes a huge amount of time.
Right. So first of all, let me tell you, I talked about the impact of the pandemic. And one of the things that the pandemic did for me, it totally screwed up my writing routines. So much so that now, like almost 2 years later, I have to reconstruct my writing routines. And this is very interesting because I now have more time. My kids are grown up. I don't have to think about and even so, funnily enough, I said, motherhood changes you. I still occasionally wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning with the sons. I have to do something. And then I realize, no, I don't. But the problem is, so I taught at first via Zoom, and then I taught it in person, and then I took a sabbatical, and it's just all so changed. And then there was this year, the pandemic year, when I basically sat in front of the computer and said, now I'm going to write all these things I never had time to write. And as a result, I procrastinated like you wouldn't believe it. Like I wasted hours, looking, like jumping from project to project, because I'm writing both fiction and academic books. So in the last year, for example, I signed contract for like 3 academic books, but I also published 2 novels and like a bunch of stories. But it's really hard. It's tough for me because you have to shift into a new headspace when you're doing academic or when you're doing fiction writing. Those are very different sets of skills and very different kinds of writing. So what I'm trying to do right now is to establish like a daily routine where I work 2 hours in the morning on nonfiction. And then I have, a coffee break or whatever, take a walk or go to the gym. And then I do academic writing. As a result, this is like great plans, but you know what happens to great plans. As a result, I spend like a day writing a novel, and then I'm consumed with guilt because I have this, academic book I'm writing, for which I have a contract, and I'm not doing it. Or I spend a whole day like doing editorial work, like you, Lesley. And then I'm like, oh, my novel, what will happen to my novel? And then I wake up in the middle of the night. And I'm like, what is happening to me? I'm wasting my life. Let me just kill myself right now. Okay. So it's really hard. And this is, you wrote this beginning with Anita. Yes, it's one way in which I think because the pandemic has done something to our sense of time. And this something is like, it has left its imprint on us and it's not going anywhere. So the time has become both kind of stretchable, infinitely, but also very limited. Yeah. And we're aware of it. And this paradox of time, I actually want to write something about it. It's, it's a non-fiction thing about what happens to time in a pandemic. And it has happened to me, and I'm sure it happened to everybody. So I'm trying, all I can say, I'm trying to reestablish my routines in such a way that I can really do both my academic and my fiction writing. And it's very, very hard.
I understand that completely. I am desperately trying to carve out time to get back to my own writing. And I feel like you struggle, you try, like you have the best intentions. And then it's like the end of the day, I'm like, I gave my time to everything else. So yeah, I definitely understand that. And I'm hoping like maybe we get past the holidays, I can reclaim some of my time and like, and figure that out. But the balance, I think, is always a struggle. Maggie and Beth, what about you? What are your writing routines look like?
Okay. Well, mine is very sporadic at this point, just because I have an almost 3-year-old. We just got a puppy, and I've got an 8-year-old who is prone to getting everything that is going through the school in terms of sickness. So he's home a lot more than I would ordinarily be used to, which has deeply impacted that schedule. I remember I wrote my first kind of attempt at a novel when he was 3, and I would do it at night, but my husband was in residency at the time, so he wasn't typically home until about 11. So I had from like 9 to 11 that I could kind of focus on that. Now he's not in residency, so there's people around. We bought my childhood home, and my parents live with us, and we're going to do the whole multi-generational thing. So there's always people around. So finding that really quiet, lone time that I really do need it to be quiet, is really hard. And I found that for most of November, I tried to do Nano. I was going to do all these stories. It was going to be great. Like I was going to get so much done. I just finished a novel draft. I was like, good, I'm raring to go on short fiction. And I wrote about 10,000 words and was like, and done. My brain is shutting down because I didn't have time to think about what and I didn't realize the extent to which I needed that built-in quiet time to really contemplate stuff. So right now, I'm actually helping my mom rent an office. She does mental health counseling, and so she occasionally needs to see people in person. So we're sharing a space, and it's just downtown for us, which is really convenient. It's only about 7 minutes from my house. And I'm trying to get in twice a week, once on Wednesday, once on Sunday, or some amalgamation of that. I have a friend's mom who will come over and kind of hang out and play with my 3-year-old for a little bit, which is what I'm doing now. And that helps kind of build those little blocks of time, because I find even if it's just a block of time, at least I get that quiet. And even if all I'm doing is reading or thinking, at least I can do it without being interrupted, because that interruption is really hard for me to get around. Otherwise it's like 10:30 to 11 o'clock at night, maybe, if I can push everybody else off to bed.
You're like, everybody out.
No, you go brush your teeth first. It's fine. Luckily, my husband does tend to fall asleep at about 10, so that's convenient for me. I'm like, you're already asleep on the couch. Go brush your teeth and go to bed, and I'll be up shortly, which might be like an hour later, but still.
Beth, what about you? What are your writing routines?
So I used to have a very dedicated writing routine before the pandemic, for sure. And then I would say, and I mean, it kept going through the pandemic, where I'd wake up, I would get my coffee in the first 2 hours of the day, I would write. And then after I had my kid, of course, new mom stuff, it's you have no, you forget how much free time you had in your life. And that was really, really, really overwhelming for the first year for me. So much so that I didn't know how people functioned with children. I was very confused of how anybody got anything done. And so it ended up, I guess, working out where I got in this horrible habit. I call it horrible because it's not very healthy, I think, for your body, where I would get up with the baby at like 3 a.m. I would feed him, I would put him back down, and then I'd write until he got back up at 7. And that was the majority of my writing time because he didn't nap. And then I got in the habit of it, which is probably not good for me now, because at least 3 or 4 times a week I get up at 3 a.m. and have coffee and write until the rest of the house wakes up, which is not great. I do not recommend.
That sounds awful.
It is. It legitimately
Mine also were not nappers, and yeah, that really wreaks havoc with your time.
Yeah. And it's funny because like now he naps, but I still, like, my body for some reason is like, oh, you're up. But at the same time, my body's also like, the sun has went down. It might be 7:30, but you're going to bed.
Right. That's the opposite. The sun goes down and I'm like, time to be awake.
See, it's something else. And I'm trying to figure out how to go back to like being a normal person.
Okay. From my experience, let me tell you something you will never be. I'm sorry to say. I actually
it's over for you.
Yeah, I did the same thing exactly. And I was more resilient. Like, I was 21 when my first son was born, and I thought I could do all of it, and I started college and whatever. But even now, I occasionally wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning with a feeling I need to get up and start writing. And my brain is like churning now, my sons all are men, like, my youngest son is a lawyer, and I still feel like, okay, now it's time to start writing. So, sorry, you will be writing at 3 o'clock in the morning forever now.
There's part of me that's like so impressed, and I'm like, man, I wish I could get out of bed at 3 a.m. and write. And then the other part of me is like, no.
I don't typically wake up until about 9. Like, I have to be up, but I'm not actually awake until about 9.
Like, I'm like, if I could bring it back a little bit. I used to get up at 5 a.m. and that's when I would write, was from like 5 to 7 when I had to wake the kids up. But then it's like, I got out of the habit now, like I think of 5 a.m. and I'm like, ew.
I swear my kids have like a sixth sense. The moment I get up, they're up. And then now we're just up for 2 extra hours with them being cranky and angry. Whereas they will sleep at night. So that's when I can generally count on them to stay asleep.
Yeah.
So I admire the morning routine. That's definitely something I can imagine being helpful.
I think that if it was switch around, if I slept in the morning and then stayed up half the night, I would write at night. And I think that my routine is now like whenever I can possibly sit down and write, which is usually when everybody else is asleep soundly.
It's the soundly part that's important, otherwise things get interrupted.
Yeah, and I've started to do this thing because my son's 2 now, and I started to do this thing where if he is doing like independent play and it's going well and it's giving me 15 extra minutes, I'll open my laptop and try to do something productive, even if it's just like work related, because I also work from home, and trying to input that in so he gets used to that and I get used to that, which is not easy.
I wrote the entire first draft of my novel while my daughter watched Dora the Explorer. But now, if there's any noise, I'm like you, Maggie. I used to work in the same room with her watching TV and it never bothered me. And now, like, something else is on and I'm like, forget it.
I have a theory about this because I find it easy with my kids' programs to read or to work But if it's even a little aged up of a program, my attention goes to the program. And I think it's anything with a clear narrative, your attention goes. But if it's something with an unclear narrative or it's repetition, then you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't even read. Like, it used to be, I read while my husband would watch TV all the time. And now I'm like, I'm going to the bedroom. And he's like, I feel like I'm running you out of the room. And I'm like, no, it's fine.
No.
I can't focus.
Yeah. I wrote my PhD with 2 kids watching the TV in the same room with me, because this is what we had at the time. And it was a good PhD. But now I can't do it. Like even the TV, any kind of noise. But you're right, Beth, it has to be, it's just music playing, I can do it. But if it's some kind of narrative, my attention instantly switches off and I just can't concentrate. So, fortunately for me, now I have unlimited time and I have my own office and I still can't get my act together. So deadlines are very helpful. This one of the things that I learned during COVID is how helpful deadlines are and how helpful it is. So, we all bitch and complain about our children, but children are living deadlines in a way, because they sort of carve your time into manageable chunk. And if you have unlimited time, it turns out you have no time at all. So I do have deadlines, academic deadlines, various deadlines, but not the kind of deadlines you ladies have. And I kind of miss it, believe it or not. So yes, I understand how you feel, but you will also find out, I believe, eventually, that it was a very productive, like in retrospective, you will see it was a very productive moment in your lives.
I think I interviewed someone a long, long time ago. I want to say it was Jeff Ryman, but I'm not entirely sure, who said that time is like a TARDIS. Work expands all the time.
Right.
However much time you have, you're still getting the same amount of work done. It just feels like you're compressed when you don't have a lot of time, but you're still doing everything. And when you have more time, it just takes longer.
No, I totally agree. I think it's a good metaphor. Yeah, time is like TARDIS. It's stretchable, but it also, it compresses. So yeah, I totally agree.
I do something with this actually, with the deadlines. I do self-imposed deadlines, where I have my calendar and I'll say, okay, this month I'm going to, if I'm working on short stories, I'm going to write 3 new drafts for a short story in 1 month. I'm going to edit 2 and I'm going to send out this many. And I make it like, this is what I got to do. And if I don't do it, then it rolls over to the next month, including whatever goals I have for that month. And that usually helps get things done for me. Now, my deadlines aren't as harsh as they used to be for myself, but I still have them.
Now, one year I did a Chekhov year where I just tried to write a short story a week, every week for an entire year. I didn't make it the whole year, but I did get 48 drafts or something done.
Wow.
Which was insane. That was before kids. Now I find my deadlines have to be a lot more fluid, and I tend to go really small. I've been doing kind of that 12-week goals where it's like, for 3 months, this is what I'm doing, and it has to be done by then. But it gives me enough time to be fluid. If the kid is sick, if the kid then gives me the cold and now I'm sick, then it gives me some of that fluidity to not panic too much at the end of the month is coming and I haven't made as much progress as I wanted. But 3 months is a kind of a good chunk. I can say, okay, I'm working on the novel for this period of time. And then little goals. I'm such a geek. I do a lot of sticker rewards for myself. Make me happy. So it's like, 500 words, you get a sticker. Oh, 1,000 words, you get a bigger sticker. And like, those things are surprisingly motivating for me. So I've just been leaning into that inner child thing for those itty bitty little goals to get things done.
Well, you have
stickers. That's a good idea.
It's
Maggie,
fun.
You have a really impressive planner system I've seen on Instagram. I mean,
things like
I live by my calendar. Like, if I don't put stuff in my calendar and it has to be handwritten out, it doesn't happen. but I think that I would get overwhelmed with the amount of like, it's very, very impressive.
It's very rigid. Yeah, I've got my regular day planner, which is just like the week kind of spread out, and then I just do my daily list, because if I don't look at it, I can tell that I'm falling off the wagon, because that's when I start letting things slip through the cracks, little things like, oh, your son has some kind of school winter project thing that you have to go in for, and boy, if I don't write that down, that is going to be forgotten. But with the writing notebook, I enjoy tracking that information, and sometimes all it takes is just a little sticker to be like, oh, I read a short story today, good for me. And sometimes that's all I get done, but that makes me feel special.
I actually used an app, which I don't use anymore, because it made me depressed, because this was a very complicated app. It didn't give you stickers. Maybe this was a problem. I needed because all it did was make me feel bad. Like I was supposed to write like 2,500 words today, and I only wrote 2,000. Bad for me, bad, Elana, why do you exist at all, right? So this kind of thing. So I eventually dropped it, and now I just use a calendar the same way I use a calendar on my iPad, on my phone. But I'm looking actually for an app or something, because I really need this. I need like a mental kind of corset, like women in Victorian age used to wear those corsets to give shapes to their bodies. This is what they thought was necessary. I need a kind of mental corset. I need impose deadlines, and a lot of my work has inbuilt deadlines. So if I need to write like a review, I have a deadline and people remind me of it and so on. But I also need deadlines for my own fiction writing. So I'm looking now. I will look for stickers. You gave me a great idea.
I love them, and I set really small goals to get them, so that's more motivating for me. I find like really dumbly small goals. Sometimes it's just like write 5 minutes. Just make sure you sit down and open the document. And then I can give myself a sticker. And sometimes that's all it takes to just feel like, oh, well, I did something today. So
because a lot of fiction projects, if you set them aside, or a lot of projects, you set them aside, they kind of grow stale. And I have a whole folder with, stories I started like years ago, and I didn't finish. And I don't know if I can go back to those projects, because they don't. Yeah, and you look at them and you think, wow, it was a great idea, but I'm just not in this frame of mind anymore.
Not the same person anymore. Yeah. I've had a few stories that have, that was kind of one of my number one advice to any of my writing friends is like, don't sit on an idea, because if you're passionate about it, get it drafted. It may be a horrible draft, but you capture something about that moment. And I feel like sometimes you can go back and edit that, but it's really impossible to get that rough, honest draft out if you're past that point.
Totally. And like a lot of my ideas come from dreams. I have very vivid dreams. So this is part of my routine now. If I have a dream, which can be like a seed for a story, I have to write it down immediately. After I get up, just write it, whatever. Because otherwise it all dissipates, and it's a pity.
Drafting is always the fun part for me. Like I can sit down and make stories up all day. Like, give me that. Let's do 8 hours of that a day. I'm ready. Editing is where I procrastinate, actually, like hardcore. Because when I'm drafting, I'm in it and I'm feeling it, and I kind of let myself go and let myself make mistakes and have fun with it. But when I'm editing, all of that has to be pulled back, and you look at it more analytically, or at least I look at it more analytically. Which is where I procrastinate, because instead of playing in a generation ship and seeing what these characters do, which, by the way, is kind of like a metaphor for small towns in my work. A lot of people are like, we write a lot of generation ships, and I'm like, well,
you're like, well,
it was from a very small town. But yeah, like. For me, drafting is a lot of fun, but editing is work. So I'll procrastinate that.
I have the worst short story methodology. That's absolutely terrible. I've gotten much better at word culling and editing once I can get into it, but it almost always takes me about, I calculated it out one time. It's like 9 months to a year after I draft something before I can look at it clearly enough to be like, oh, I can tweak this and it'll work, versus just being like, it's terrible, the whole thing is terrible, I'm ripping everything out, and then it's not even the same story anymore. So I'm working on that, but that's hard. It's hard to get that distance in order to edit it properly and carefully enough.
And well, I mean, you said you had 48 drafts that one year, so
exactly. So I've got a lot of backdrafts.
I was gonna say, so you should have a lot to work with.
Exactly. Yeah, I tend to draft a certain number of stories a year, and then I'll let them sit for a while. And I'm now it's funny because just the other day I was thinking, oh, this one story I wrote, I really like that story. I want to work on that. When did I? And I look back on my calendar, and yeah, I wrote it about a year ago. That's about how long it takes. I don't know why. It would be a lot if it were faster, because I'd like it to be faster, but.
This is so interesting, because for me it's just the opposite, and I have like different problems with novel writing and short story writing. So for me, drafting is the most difficult part, because I have like an idea, often an image. I just start with a kind of visual image, but I have no idea where it's going to go. But once I have like a basic plot, it's easier to edit. At least it's easier for me. But this works very well for short stories. But with novel writing, you have to have a kind of idea what you're going to write. And I often don't. And which means I start with something and then evolves into something else. And I edit it and revise it. Like the last novel I published, I think I revised it, I don't know, 15 times or maybe more. I don't even remember. And at the end, it was nothing like what I thought it would be to begin with. So again, I'm like, you said, Maggie, you're a geek. Maybe you can recommend. I'm looking for a software, and I found something which will help me to plot ahead. Because for me, this is the most difficult part. Not the writing itself, not the editing, but creating a kind of narrative arc, especially in a longer work. In a short story, it's easier.
So Maggie, do you have any suggestions? How do you keep your longer work?
Well, I used to plot things out. But the last one I just wrote, though, I wrote really weird, and it's totally it's almost a different genre for me. It's almost more curio fiction. So it's got that very realistic base with one weird twist to it. And I ended up writing that one completely out of order. I just wrote every scene as it hit me. I didn't know what was going to fit together. I'd be like, hey, let's have him talking to his wife about setting up a will, because me and my husband were doing that at the time. And I was very prominent in my mind. And then I was like, hey, let's have him finding a skeleton city, that's connected to his house. That'll be fun. And it just jumped all over the place. And I would just kind of brainstorm on what I had already written and then fill in gaps ahead of and behind those, and made this very strange amalgamation of scenes that I haven't even read in order yet. Because I wrote them so out of order, and I wanted to preserve that kind of unseeing it kind of process. I wanted to read it fresh. So that's what I'm starting on in January, is going back, and I'll be retyping the entire thing from the beginning and filling in, because I know there's places where things are missing. And I'm going to try and fill those in kind of more accurately at that point. But it'll also help me see what of those scenes do I actually like, which ones do I actually want to keep, what things do I want to emphasize in other parts of the manuscript. But it was very nonlinear, which I've never done before. So I wish I could give more advice on it, but honestly, it was a little screwy this last time.
Beth, do you plot everything out, or are you just pantsing it going in there?
I feel like that's a yes and no answer, because for short stories, I start off with an idea. Wouldn't it be cool if? Or I start out with a character. What if can I make a character that is an AI and then be interesting enough to carry a story? Let's just see. But with novels usually come from when I set out to do a novel, I usually have a rough idea of what the start is, what the middle is, and what the ending is, what the arc, what's the main event that leads to the ending. And I'll kind of write those out. But I'm not somebody that will go chapter by chapter and chapter. I'm not somebody that's this happens in this chapter, this happens in this chapter. No, I know the beginning, middle, and end, and I know the inciting events. And I know how I want my characters to change, but not always how they will end up changing. So I give myself enough leeway to do some discovery writing, because I feel like that's where some of the best stuff comes from sometimes. And a lot of it you throw away. Like I'm not I don't want to say like, oh, this is the best and this is where the magic happens, because it can be, but there's so much of that you also throw away because it does nothing when you come back to edit for the actual story. But like we do the writing thing because we love the writing thing, and then that's one of the things I love about the writing thing is discovery writing. So I let myself do that, even if I throw it away later. I feel like it's worth it. And too, a lot of that stuff might show up in short stories later, or might show up in novellas later, because I think for me personally, the main point of it is to have fun with it, and I think so. I think as writers we get we have to get this done, we have to send these stories out, and we have to. You don't. That's the thing, is in reality you don't. You can have fun. Actually, some of the best work is when you're just having fun, in my opinion.
That's one of the things I've been working on lately, is because you can get into that all the productivity books out there are very corporate focused.
Yes.
So, you produce a product, you Q&A it, and then you send it out and you work on it, and it can be very creatively crushing sometimes when it's too like product monetary oriented. Not that in no way writers should be paid for their work, but there is this angle of corporate mentality that can kind of seep into that productivity thing that I have to really fight that, because there is that feeling like you are what you produce, and that can get into your head and kind of mess things up sometimes.
Oh yeah. And it's not just corporate. I agree with you, but it's not just corporate, it's also academic. And it has been like so deeply ingrained in me because of my academic experience, because in the academy, especially when you start, in the academy, you have to publish, and have to publish a lot. And this is how your worth is measured, and this is what goes on your CV, and this is how you're promoted and everything. And so once for the first 10 years, I think, after my PhD, I didn't do any fiction writing because I had to publish all the time. And so now it's very difficult for me to get out of this headspace and not to feel that, oh, I have to be productive, I have to publish, I don't have to, not anymore, but I still am in this kind of mindset. And yeah, I agree with Beth. We need to have fun. All my best writing comes from, ideas, and I enjoy the process of writing. It's a great thing. But yeah, it's very difficult to get out of this idea that we have to do this. Yeah.
So let's we're almost out of time, but quickly before we sign off, I kind of wanted to talk about, we're talking about the writing process, but what are you guys reading? Like what do you read? How do you read? Because I think that how you read kind of influences how you write. So I just wanted to discuss that.
Well, a great thing about being an academic is that I can read any junk I like, and then I justify myself by saying I'm doing research, which is kind of true. So my first published book was called Blood Scripts, and it's all about serial killers in fiction, not in real life. And, I read a lot of mystery novels. I still do, and I still enjoy them. And this is my research. But recently I started reading more of the stuff that I want to write. So, because right now I'm working on a fantasy novel, I'm reading more fantasy, which I didn't used to do. I like science fiction better than fantasy, but somehow, because my writing now, for some reason, turns in the direction of dark fantasy and horror, I'm reading more of the stuff. and I'm reading with a different eye, because it's one thing to read as an academic. You look for like specific issues, right? But if you read as a writer, you're looking at how it's all put together, right? So you can learn from it. So to answer your question, I'm reading a lot of fantasy now, like epic fantasy, but more importantly, dark fantasy. And it's a very interesting genre. Most of my writing now is in this genre.
You will be
good. Stare down to see who will go next.
I am in my favorite. Okay, I don't. So I'll read almost anything. I wasn't somebody that grew up like with a ton of books in their house or anything, and I kind of like when I fell into reading, I was like, oh, new worlds, and it took off. And now I have book in multiple books in almost every room of my house. I think right now I am reading something by Cory Doctorow. I'm like looking for it. I'm like, where is it? But I think one of my favorite things is if you give me something with like really pretty prose, but the content is like science fiction or fantasy soap opera, but with pretty prose, like amazing prose. You have a fan in me for life. Legitly, I will then read anything you write. I don't care. I love it. I will eat it. And ironically, I don't always write it. But some of the things like I love to read, I probably would never write myself because it seems hard. Although I do think that I occasionally do some really nice prose. But yeah, that's what I'm into for sure.
Yeah, it's funny, Elana. I've been doing almost the exact opposite. So I used to read almost exclusively a lot of science fiction, fantasy, horror, all that kind of stuff. And now I'm shifting into the really lit versions of that and sometimes completely out of it. I really got hooked on Haruki Murakami when I first encountered him.
He's fabulous, right?
That kind of thing, that real realism with that real mundane element, like that's my jam. I'm like, I want boring dinners at home listening to records and contemplating what am I doing with my life, but then also having talking cats. So anything in that kind of realm. I recently read I think it's Sayada Murata who did The Convenience Store Woman, which is just a tiny little book, but oh god, I love so that. Good. It's so weird in the best of ways, but then also like really mundane when she's like, have we put more hot dogs in the hot dog turner? And I just love that kind of stuff. I think some of it is that, and some of it maybe that pandemic thing too, of I want to slow down. I want to read things that are just very calm and contemplative. And I've been really leaning hard into that lately. I just finished reading Bad Thoughts. Oh gosh, who's the author? I'll have to look that one up. Put that in the chat. But it's just like all these little mini short stories about just the weirdness of various belief systems. And the author herself lives in California and has encountered lots of different new age kind of philosophies. And so a lot of her stories kind of tackle those ideas and playing with them. And she is so funny. I mean, that's what I like about Shirley Jackson too, is she's dark, but she's funny. And I love that. And so I lean a lot into that. And I tend to pick an author and just read a lot. Right now, my relaxation reading is either Rex Stout, Nero Wolfe novels, or Dick Francis horse racing novels. Because I just find they're very different from my normal life. And I find them very entertaining and very relaxing.
It's so interesting. This is why I read mysteries. So I read a lot of dark fantasy, but I write dark fantasy. So I read with a kind of professional eye. But for relaxation, I read Scandinavian mysteries, like Nordic noir.
Yeah, those are great.
They give you a kind of texture of everyday life. And I've been to Norway and Sweden, but I'm not Norwegian. And they also have this very strong plot. it's not a kind of thing I will ever write. I'm not going to write Nordic noir, even though I actually wrote and published an academic essay about Nordic noir. So it's all, it all goes into this blender. But I understand what you're saying about the texture of everyday life and how we're deprived, especially again during the pandemic. I felt I was unreal in some way, and I needed this kind of literary realism to ground myself. But as I said, I read and I also like Chinese and Japanese mysteries for the same reason.
Absolutely.
They give you the texture of everyday life, which is exotic, but not too exotic. I've been to China and Japan. So it's both familiar and totally unfamiliar, and it has this narrative sweep, which for me is very important. I admire you. I love Murakami. He's a great writer. But it's not something I would read for relaxation, to be honest. I need a strong narrative to be drawn into the book. But I am with you. I need also this details of everyday life, because we feel life feels unreal sometimes.
Definitely does. And somehow that really enhances the weird in a way that I just really like. I like that contrast. Just the way that Murakami kind of takes an ordinary person in an ordinary situation, and then like the frog in the boiling pot of water just gradually increases the weird until it's so weird. You're like, how could you ever accept any of this as real? And yet you get it because you're like, no, it's been happening this whole time. I love that element.
And he also has a nonfiction book called Underground, which is absolutely fabulous.
Oh, I read that one. It's so good. That is fascinating.
This is fascinating. And I was reading it when I was in Japan, and I felt like, I understand it so much better now. So that's really interesting.
Well, our hour is just about up. I just wanted to thank all three of you for coming and talking about your stories that are in the anthology and sharing your writing process and what you're reading. It's been very fascinating.
Thank you so much, Lesley.
Thank you so much. It was great meeting all my fellow authors in the flesh, as it were. And thank you for inviting us. It was really interesting.
We'll be TOC buddies.
Yes. Sounds great.
All right. Thanks again, and bye.